On July 15, 1996, the Thompson family vanished from their beach cottage on Cedar Island at exactly 3:30 a.m. Three people witnessed what happened that night. Three people gave statements to police. Three completely different stories. No bodies were ever found. No evidence was ever discovered. No arrests were ever made. But 28 years later, when hurricane cleanup crews discover something buried in the sand, investigators uncover a truth that changes everything. Before you hear their testimonies, subscribe, because you're about to become a jury of one. Three witnesses saw the same family disappear. Three people swore they were telling the truth. But one of them wasn't just watching the Thompsons vanish. One of them was making them disappear. Tonight, you'll hear three different versions of the same night, three different truths, but only one of them is real. And by the end, you'll know who destroyed an innocent family to protect their criminal empire. Because sometimes, the person you trust to protect the community is the one preying on it. Detective Captain Sarah Morrison had seen enough cold cases in her 20-year career to know when something didn't fit. But the Thompson family file felt different from the moment she opened it in her office on a gray November morning in 2024. It wasn't just the tragic circumstances. Families had disappeared before, lost to storms and tides that showed no mercy to those who underestimated the ocean's power. What made this case unusual was how quickly it had been closed. Too quickly. Morrison sat in her chair reading through evidence that had been sealed away for nearly 30 decades. The Cedar Island Police Department had recently been absorbed into the county system, and all their old files were being digitized. The Thompson case was among them, and what Morrison found made her reach for her phone to call the state police. Hidden in the evidence room, investigators had discovered audio recordings that were never entered into the official case file. 3 cassette tapes, each labeled with a witness name. 3 testimonies that painted a very different picture than the brief police report that blamed the family's disappearance on a freak storm surge. Morrison pressed play on the first tape. "My name is Sheriff David Blake, and I need someone to know what really happened during the Thompson family investigation." The voice was older, weathered by years of carrying secrets. Morrison could hear the weight of regret even through the static of the old recording. "I was the lead investigator on the Thompson disappearance in July 1996. At the time, I thought I was conducting a thorough investigation into a tragic accident. But looking back now, I realize I was being manipulated from the very beginning." Morrison pulled up Sheriff Blake's official report from 1996. It was surprisingly brief for such a significant case, only 4 pages describing the disappearance of an entire family. But Blake's tape was telling a much more complex story. The Thompson family, David, 42, Rebecca, 38, and their 2 children, Emma, 12, and Michael, 8, were renting the Sandpiper Cottage for a week-long family vacation. They'd arrived on Saturday, July 13th, and were scheduled to check out the following Saturday. Blake's voice became more troubled. On the morning of July 16th, the property management company sent a maintenance worker to check on a reported problem with the cottage's water heater. When he arrived, he found the front door wide open, breakfast food still on the table, and no sign of the family. Morrison checked the timeline in the official report. Blake's account matched the documented facts, but she sensed there was much more to the story. "I was called to the scene around 10 a.m. What I found didn't make sense for a typical missing persons case. The cottage looked like the family had stepped away for just a few minutes. Coffee was still warm in the pot. Eggs were half-eaten on plates. The shower was running in the master bathroom." Paused for a shaky breath. But there were also signs that something had gone wrong. The sliding glass door to the beach was not just open, but pulled completely off its track, like someone had forced it. Sand was tracked through the entire cottage, but not in the pattern you'd expect from people walking normally. It looked like something heavy had been dragged across the floor. This was new information. The official report had mentioned an open door and some sand in the cottage, but characterized it as normal for a beach rental. I also found something that bothered me immediately. The family's personal belongings were all still in the cottage. Wallets, car keys, Rebecca Thompson's purse with her medication still inside. David Thompson was diabetic, and his insulin was in the refrigerator. These weren't people who had left voluntarily for an extended period. Morrison made a note. If the family had left their essential belongings behind, it suggested they had either left in extreme haste or had been taken against their will. My initial theory was that the family had gone for an early morning walk on the beach and had been caught by an unexpected storm surge.
We'd had severe weather 2 nights earlier, and the tides were still unpredictable. But even as I was developing this theory, I noticed things that didn't fit. The storm had been on July 14th, not the 15th. By the morning of the 16th, the weather was calm and the tides were normal. More importantly, if a storm surge had taken the family, we should have found some evidence, clothing, personal items, something washed up on the beach. I spent 3 days conducting a thorough search of the area. We had Coast Guard helicopters, search and rescue teams, and dozens of volunteers combing the beach and surrounding waters. We found nothing that belonged to the Thompson family. That's when I started to suspect that the family's disappearance might not have been an accident. I began looking for other explanations: foul play, kidnapping, or some other form of criminal activity. I started by interviewing everyone who had contact with the Thompson family during their stay: the property management company, local businesses where they'd shopped, restaurant staff where they'd eaten. Most people remembered them as a typical tourist family, polite, quiet, spending money and enjoying their vacation. But 2 people I interviewed gave me information that suggested something more sinister had happened. Carol Winters, who worked for the local turtle patrol, mentioned that she'd been working on the beach near the Sandpiper cottage the night before the family disappeared. She said she'd seen unusual activity around 3 a.m., lights where there shouldn't have been lights, vehicles where there shouldn't have been vehicles. Murison made rapid notes. Carol Winters would be one of the other voices on the tapes. The second person was Mike Sullivan, who worked as a maintenance contractor for various property management companies on the island. Sullivan told me that he'd been working on a different cottage about half a mile from the Sandpiper around midnight on July 15th. He said he'd heard what sounded like an argument coming from the direction of the Thompson cottage, followed by the sound of a boat engine. Murison realized that Blake had potentially identified 2 key witnesses to whatever happened to the Thompson family. Based on these interviews, I developed a new theory. I believed that the Thompson family had encountered some kind of criminal activity on the beach, possibly drug smuggling or some other illegal operation. They had either witnessed something they shouldn't have witnessed or had tried to intervene in some way. Blake's voice became more bitter. I was preparing to expand the investigation, bring in state police resources, and pursue the criminal angle aggressively. That's when I received a visit from my supervisor, Chief Robert Manning. Murison felt her pulse quicken. If Blake had been pressured to abandon his investigation, it suggested a cover-up at the highest levels of local law enforcement. Chief Manning told me that the Thompson case was becoming too expensive and too time-consuming for our small department. He said that without any evidence of foul play, we needed to conclude that the family had been victims of an accidental drowning and close the case. Blake paused for a long moment. I argued with him. I told him about the witness statements, about the inconsistencies in the storm surge theory, about the evidence that suggested criminal activity. But Manning was adamant. He said the case was closed and that any further investigation would be handled by state authorities if new evidence emerged. Murison noted that no state investigation had ever been initiated, despite Blake's apparent request for one. I should have fought harder. I should have contacted the state police directly, or the FBI, or someone with the authority to overrule Manning. But I was young, I was dependent on my job, and I was afraid of the consequences of challenging my superior. Blake's voice became thick with regret. So I wrote the official report concluding that the Thompson family had been accidentally drowned during a storm surge. I filed it away and tried to convince myself that I'd done everything I could within the constraints of my position. Murison realized that she was listening to a confession of professional failure that had haunted Blake for decades.
But I never forgot about the inconsistencies. Over the years, I kept thinking about Carol Winters' description of unusual activity, about Mike Sullivan's account of hearing an argument and a boat engine. I kept wondering what had really happened to that family. Blake's voice strengthened. In 2010, I was promoted to Chief of Police after Manning retired. One of the first things I did was reopen the Thompson file and review all the evidence. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Morton leaned closer to the recorder. Manning had suppressed witness statements. He had failed to follow up on leads that I had documented. He had actively prevented a thorough investigation of what was clearly a criminal matter. Blake paused again, but it was too late. 14 years had passed. Physical evidence had been lost or degraded. Witnesses had moved away or died. The trail was completely cold. Morrison could hear Blake crying softly. "I tried to reopen the investigation anyway. I contacted the state police and requested that they review the case, but without new evidence or witnesses, they said there was nothing they could do." Blake's voice became more determined. "That's when I started making these recordings. I wanted to document everything I knew about the Thompson case, all the leads that had never been followed, all the evidence that had been ignored. I hoped that someday someone would have the resources and the authority to find out what really happened to that family." Morrison realized that Blake had been trying to preserve the truth about the Thompson investigation for future generations. "There's something else I need to say. Something that I've never told anyone because I was afraid of what it might mean." Morrison waited. "About 6 months after I closed the Thompson case, I started noticing changes in the local drug activity on Cedar Island. We'd always had some minor problems, mostly marijuana smuggling, occasional cocaine shipments. But suddenly, the island became a major transit point for large-scale drug operations." Blake's voice became darker. The smugglers were sophisticated, well-organized, and apparently well-connected. Every time we tried to investigate their activities, we would hit roadblocks. Witnesses would refuse to cooperate. Evidence would disappear. Higher authorities would intervene and shut down our operations. Morrison realized that Blake was describing the emergence of the criminal enterprise that might have been responsible for the Thompson family's disappearance. "I began to suspect that the Thompson family had stumbled onto the early stages of this drug operation. Maybe they'd seen something they shouldn't have seen, or maybe they'd tried to report suspicious activity to authorities." Blake paused. "If that's true, then the Thompson family was murdered to protect a criminal enterprise that went on to operate freely on Cedar Island for decades, and I failed to stop it because I allowed myself to be intimidated by corrupt superiors." Morrison felt sick. If Blake's suspicions were correct, the Thompson family had died because they had tried to do the right thing, and their deaths had been covered up to protect criminals. "I want to conclude by saying that I've lived with the guilt of this failure for 28 years. Not a day goes by that I don't think about David and Rebecca Thompson and their 2 children. They deserved justice, and I failed to provide it." Blake's voice became urgent. "If someone is listening to this recording, please don't let the Thompson family be forgotten. They were good people who died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time or because they tried to stand up to criminals. They deserve to have their story told, and their killers deserve to be held accountable." Blake's final words were delivered with quiet intensity. "The truth about what happened to the Thompson family is still out there. Someone knows what happened at night. Someone knows where their bodies are. Someone knows who killed them and why. Don't let the people responsible for this cover-up continue to escape justice. Don't let the Thompson family's deaths be meaningless. Find the truth, no matter how long it takes or how difficult it becomes." The tape clicked off, leaving Morrison staring at evidence of a systematic cover-up that had allowed killers to escape justice for nearly 3 decades.
Morrison made rapid notes. Sheriff Blake conducted initial investigation, identified key witnesses, developed criminal theory, pressured by superior to close case prematurely. Suspect's family murdered by drug smuggling operation. Cover-up prevented proper investigation. She paused, then added, "Question. What did Carol Winters and Mike Sullivan really see that night? Why was Chief Manning so determined to prevent a thorough investigation?" Morrison reached for the second tape, labeled Carol Winters, wondering what the Turtle Patrol worker had witnessed that had been deemed too dangerous to investigate properly. "My name is Carol Winters, and I've been carrying a terrible secret for 28 years. Morrison pressed play on the second tape, struck by the pain and guilt in the woman's voice. According to the case file, Carol Winters had been 34 years old in 1996, working as a volunteer coordinator for the Cedar Island Turtle Patrol. I need to start by explaining what Turtle Patrol really was in 1996, because most people didn't understand what we were actually doing out there on the beaches at night. Carol's voice was hoarse, like someone who had spent years smoking and drinking to forget something terrible. Officially, we were volunteers who monitored sea turtle nesting sites during the summer months. We'd walk the beaches after dark, looking for nesting females and marking their sites to protect them from human interference. It was important conservation work, and most of the people involved were genuinely committed to protecting the turtles. Carol paused, and Morrison could hear her lighting a cigarette. But some of us were doing other things during those nighttime patrols, things that had nothing to do with sea turtles. Morrison felt her pulse quicken. Carol was about to reveal the criminal activity that Sheriff Blake had suspected. I started working with Turtle Patrol in 1994, 2 years before the Thompson family disappeared. At first, it really was just about the turtles. I loved being on the beach at night, helping protect these incredible creatures that had been nesting on our shores for thousands of years. Carol's voice became more troubled. But in early 1995, I was approached by Mike Sullivan. Mike was also involved with Turtle Patrol, though he spent most of his time working on the equipment and logistics rather than doing actual beach patrols. Morrison made a note. Mike Sullivan had been identified by Sheriff Blake as the contractor who claimed to have heard an argument and boat engine the night that Thompsons disappeared. Mike told me that he had an opportunity for me to make some extra money. As a single mother working 2 part-time jobs, I was always struggling financially, so I was interested in hearing what he had to offer. Carol took a shaky breath. Mike explained that certain people were using the waters around Cedar Island to transport goods, and they needed reliable lookouts who could work at night without attracting attention. Turtle Patrol was perfect. We had legitimate reasons to be on the beach after dark, and we had radios to communicate with each other. Morrison realized that Carol was describing her recruitment into a drug smuggling operation. Mike said all I had to do was watch for Coast Guard patrols and signal if it was safe for boats to approach the shore. He said the boats were carrying cigarettes and alcohol, avoiding taxes and regulations. He made it sound like a victimless crime that would help me pay my bills. Carol's voice became bitter. I was naive enough to believe him, at least at first. The extra money was desperately needed, and it seemed like a small thing to do. I would just walk my normal Turtle Patrol route and radio Mike if I saw any law enforcement activity. Morrison noted that Carol had been gradually drawn into criminal activity through financial pressure and misinformation about the true nature of the operation. For the first year, that's all I did. I would walk the beach, look for turtle nests, and occasionally report Coast Guard movements to Mike. I told myself that I wasn't really doing anything wrong, that I was just helping people avoid unfair taxes. Carol paused again. But by the summer of 1996, I was starting to realize that Mike's operation was much larger and more dangerous than he had originally described. The boats were coming more frequently, carrying larger loads and involving more people. I was also starting to see things that made me doubt that we were just smuggling cigarettes. Morrison leaned forward, sensing that Carol was approaching the events of July 15, 1996. The night that Thompson family disappeared, I was scheduled for a routine Turtle Patrol shift from midnight to 6 a.m. My section included the beach in front of the Sandpiper cottage where the Thompsons were staying.
Carol's breathing became more labored. Around 1 a.m., I received a radio call from Mike. He said there was going to be a special delivery that night, and that I needed to make sure the beach was completely clear of any civilians or law enforcement. Morrison realized that Carol had been given advance warning that criminal activity was planned for that specific area. I walked the entire stretch of beach twice, making sure there were no late-night fishermen, couples walking on the sand, or anyone else who might witness whatever Mike had planned. The beach was completely deserted except for me. Carol's voice became more urgent. Around 2:30 a.m., I saw lights approaching from the water. It was a large boat, much bigger than the ones that usually came for Mike's deliveries. As it got closer to shore, I could see that there were at least 4 people on board. Morrison made rapid notes. Carol was describing what appeared to be a major smuggling operation. The boat anchored about 50 yards offshore, and 2 people got into a smaller inflatable boat and came to the beach. I was positioned about a quarter mile away, hidden behind some dunes, but I had binoculars and I could see everything clearly. Carol paused for a long moment. The 2 people who came ashore weren't just picking up or dropping off cargo. They were scouting the area, checking the beach access points, and examining the cottages that faced the water. It looked like they were planning something much more significant than a simple smuggling run. Morrison realized that Carol had witnessed the criminal planning phase of whatever happened to the Thompson family. I should have left then. I should have called off my patrol and reported what I was seeing to the authorities. But I was scared of Mike, scared of losing the extra money, and scared of what might happen to me if I interfered with the operation. Carol's voice became thick with tears. Around 3 a.m., I heard voices coming from the direction of the Sandpiper cottage. At first, I thought it might be the Thompson family coming out to see what was happening on the beach, but as the voices got closer, I realized that some of them belonged to the people from the boat. Morrison felt her blood run cold. Carol was describing the moment when the Thompson family had encountered the criminals.
I moved closer, trying to get a better view of what was happening. I could see a family, 2 adults and 2 children, standing on the deck of the cottage, talking to the 2 men from the boat. Carol's breathing became irregular. At first, the conversation seemed normal, like maybe the family was just curious about the boat or asking if everything was okay. But then the tone changed. The voices became more aggressive, more threatening. Morrison could hear Carol crying softly. I should have called for help. I should have radioed the Coast Guard or the police or someone. But I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do, and I was afraid that if I tried to interfere, something terrible would happen to me too. Carol paused to collect herself. The argument continued for maybe 10 minutes. I could hear the father trying to calm things down, trying to get his family back inside the cottage, but the men from the boat wouldn't let them leave. Morrison realized that Carol had witnessed the beginning of the Thompson family's abduction. Then I heard the mother scream. It was the sound that I'll never forget. Pure terror and desperation. That's when I knew that this wasn't just an argument anymore. Something violent was happening. Carol's voice became more urgent. I saw the men from the boat forcing the family toward the beach. The father was trying to protect his children. The mother was trying to break free. But there were other people involved now, people who had been waiting in the dunes, people I hadn't seen before. Morrison felt sick. Carol was describing a coordinated kidnapping and assault. The family was dragged down to the water's edge. I could see them struggling, could hear them pleading for their lives. The children were crying, calling for their parents. It was the most horrific thing I've ever witnessed. Carol paused for a long moment.
The men from the boat had radios, and they were calling back to the larger vessel offshore. I could hear them saying things like, "We have a problem and need to clean this up." It was clear that the Thompson family had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, and that the criminals were going to eliminate them to protect their operation. Morrison realized that the Thompson family had been murdered simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The family was forced into the inflatable boat and taken out to the larger vessel. I watched through my binoculars as they were transferred onto the deck of the bigger boat. Carol's voice became barely audible. That was the last time I ever saw the Thompson family alive. The boat stayed offshore for about an hour, and then it disappeared into the darkness. I never saw it again. Morrison felt tears in her eyes. She was listening to an eyewitness account of a family being murdered. I stayed hidden in the dunes until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun came up, I walked back to the sandpiper cottage. The sliding door was damaged, there was sand everywhere, and signs of a struggle. But there was no sign of the family. Carol paused again. I should have gone to the police immediately. I should have told them everything I had seen, regardless of the consequences for myself. But I was terrified that Mike Sullivan and his associates would kill me if I talked. Morrison understood Carol's fear, but realized that her silence had allowed the criminals to escape justice. Later that morning, I heard that the Thompson family had been reported missing. When Sheriff Blake interviewed me, I lied about everything. I told him that I had been patrolling a different section of beach that night, that I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Carol's voice became defensive. I convinced myself that even if I told the truth, it wouldn't bring the Thompson family back. They were already dead, and all I would accomplish by talking would be to get myself killed too. Morrison noted that Carol had made a calculation that her own life was more important than justice for the Thompson family. Over the following weeks and months, I watched Sheriff Blake's investigation slowly wind down. I could see that he suspected something more than an accidental drowning, but he wasn't getting any cooperation from witnesses or higher authorities. Carol's voice became bitter. I also watched Mike Sullivan continue his operations as if nothing had happened. The smuggling continued, the money continued to flow, and nobody seemed to care that an innocent family had been murdered. Morrison realized that Carol had been forced to watch the criminals profit from their crimes while the victims were forgotten. I tried to quit Turtle Patrol and distance myself from Mike's operation, but he wouldn't let me go. He said that I knew too much, that I was too valuable as a lookout, and that leaving would be bad for my health. Carol paused. So I continued working for Mike for another 3 years, until 1999, when I finally found the courage to move away from Cedar Island.
I relocated to the mainland, changed my name, and tried to start a new life. Morrison made a note to check if Carol Winters had indeed moved away from the area in 1999. But you can't escape the memories of watching a family be murdered. You can't forget the sound of children crying for their parents. You can't stop feeling guilty about your cowardice and complicity. Carol's voice became more emotional. I've struggled with alcoholism, depression, and post-traumatic stress for 28 years. I've been in and out of therapy, in and out of rehab, trying to find a way to live with what I saw and what I failed to do. Morrison could hear the genuine pain and regret in Carol's voice. In 2010, I heard that Sheriff Blake had become the new chief of police and was trying to reopen the Thompson case. I almost contacted him then to tell him what I knew, but I was still too scared, still too weak to face the consequences of my actions. Carol paused. But I can't stay silent anymore. The Thompson family deserves justice, and I deserve to finally tell the truth about what happened to them.
Carol's voice strengthened for a final statement. Mike Sullivan murdered the Thompson family on July 15, 1996. I watched him and his associates kidnap them from their cottage and take them out to sea. I know he killed them to protect his drug smuggling operation. Morrison felt her pulse racing. Carol had just provided direct testimony implicating Mike Sullivan in multiple murders. I also know that Mike's operation was much larger than just one man. He had connections to law enforcement, to local government, to people with the power to cover up his crimes. That's why the investigation was shut down so quickly and why no one has ever been held accountable. Carol took a shaky breath. If someone is listening to this recording, please don't let the Thompson family be forgotten any longer. David and Rebecca Thompson were good parents who were trying to protect their children from criminals. Emma and Michael Thompson were innocent children who died because their family happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carol's final words were delivered with quiet determination. I'm willing to testify about what I saw that night, regardless of the consequences for myself. I'm tired of living with this secret, tired of protecting people who don't deserve protection, tired of letting victims go without justice. Find Mike Sullivan. Make him pay for what he did to the Thompson family. And when you do, remember that their deaths weren't just a tragedy. They were a crime that was covered up by people who valued money and power more than human life. The tape clicked off, leaving Morrison with direct eyewitness testimony to a quadruple murder that had been covered up for nearly 3 decades. Morrison made rapid notes. Carol Winters, eyewitness to Thompson family kidnapping and murder, worked as lookout for Sullivan's drug operation, watched family forced onto boat, never returned, intimidated into silence for 28 years, ready to testify against Sullivan. She paused, then added, Question. Is Mike Sullivan still alive? Can his drug smuggling operation be traced and prosecuted? How extensive was the law enforcement corruption that protected him? Morrison reached for the final tape, labeled Mike Sullivan, knowing that she was about to hear the confession of a man who had destroyed an innocent family to protect his criminal empire. My name is Mike Sullivan, and I want to confess to the murders of David Thompson, Rebecca Thompson, Emma Thompson, and Michael Thompson. Morrison nearly dropped the recorder. This was a direct confession to quadruple murder from the man who had been identified by both previous witnesses as the primary suspect. I'm making this recording because I'm dying. Lung cancer, stage 4. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left, and I don't want to take this secret to my grave. Sullivan's voice was rough, damaged by decades of smoking and hard living. Morrison could hear the wheeze of diseased lungs in his breathing. I need to start by explaining how I became the kind of person who could murder an innocent family. I wasn't born evil. I made choices, one after another, that led me down a path I never thought I would take. Sullivan paused to catch his breath. I grew up on Cedar Island in the 1960s and 70s. My father was a fisherman, my mother worked at the local grocery store. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. I was a normal kid, played baseball, got decent grades, had friends and girlfriends, and all the typical teenage experiences. Morrison realized that Sullivan was trying to humanize himself before confessing to horrific crimes.
After high school, I started working construction and maintenance jobs around the island. The work was seasonal and unreliable, but it paid well enough during the summer tourist season to get by. I wasn't ambitious or particularly smart, but I was strong and willing to work hard. Sullivan's voice became more bitter. The problem was that Cedar Island was changing. In the 1980s and 90s, property values started skyrocketing as wealthy people from the mainland bought up land for vacation homes. The locals who had lived there for generations couldn't afford to buy property anymore, and many of us were getting priced out of our own community. Morrison understood that Sullivan was describing the economic pressures that had driven him toward criminal activity. By the early 1990s, I was struggling to make ends meet. The construction work was getting more competitive as outside contractors moved in with better equipment and lower prices. I was drinking too much, behind on my bills, and angry about how my life was turning out. Sullivan paused again.
That's when I met Domingo Restrepo. Domingo was a Colombian businessman who had started buying properties on Cedar Island. He told people he was in the import-export business, but anyone with half a brain could figure out that he was involved in drug trafficking. Morrison felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. Sullivan was describing his introduction to organized crime. Domingo approached me in 1993 with an offer. He needed someone who knew the island, someone who could move around at night without attracting attention, someone who could coordinate logistics for his import business. He offered me more money than I'd ever made in my life. Sullivan's voice became defensive. At first, I told myself that I was just helping to smuggle cigarettes and alcohol. Domingo said his boats were bringing in goods from the Caribbean to avoid U.S. taxes and regulations. He made it sound like a victimless crime that was actually helping consumers get cheaper products. Morrison noted that Sullivan had used the same justification that Carol Winters had described. But it didn't take long for me to realize that Domingo's operation was much more serious than cigarette smuggling. The boats were carrying cocaine, heroin, and other hard drugs. The operation involved dozens of people both on the island and on the mainland, and the money involved was enormous. Sullivan took a labored breath. By 1994, I was fully committed to Domingo's operation. I was coordinating boat landings, managing local lookouts, and overseeing the transport of drugs from the beaches to distribution points inland. I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of, and I was addicted to the lifestyle that the money provided. Morrison realized that Sullivan had become a key figure in a major drug trafficking network. The Turtle Patrol connection was my idea. I realized that environmental volunteers had perfect cover for nighttime beach activities. They had legitimate reasons to be on the sand after dark, they had radios for communication, and they were generally trusted by local authorities. Sullivan's voice became prouder, as if he was boasting about his criminal innovation. I recruited several Turtle Patrol volunteers to work as lookouts and coordinators for our operations. Most of them thought they were just helping with minor smuggling activities. Carol Winters was one of them, a single mother who needed money and was willing to ask questions. Morrison noted that Sullivan was confirming Carol's account of her recruitment into the operation. By 1996, our operation was handling millions of dollars worth of drugs every month. We had boats coming from Colombia, Venezuela, and other South American countries. We had distribution networks throughout the southeastern United States. We had corrupt officials protecting us at every level of government. Sullivan took a labored breath. But success in the drug business also brings increased scrutiny. The Coast Guard was starting to pay more attention to Cedar Island. The DEA was investigating unusual financial activity in the area. We were under pressure to be more careful and more sophisticated in our operations. Morrison sensed that Sullivan was approaching the events that led to the Thompson family's murder. On July 15, 1996, we had scheduled a major delivery. 3 boats carrying over 500 pounds of cocaine and heroin. It was one of the largest shipments we'd ever handled, worth over $20 million on the street. Sullivan's breathing became more labored. Everything was planned perfectly. Carol Winters was on lookout duty, the beach was cleared, and our transport vehicles were in position. The boats arrived on schedule around 2:30 a.m., and we began the process of moving the drugs from the ships to the shore. Morrison realized that Sullivan was describing the same night that Carol had witnessed the Thompson family's encounter with the criminals. That's when everything went wrong. The Thompson family came out of their cottage to investigate the activity on the beach. They saw our boats, they saw our people,
and they saw us moving large packages that were obviously not legitimate cargo. Sullivan's voice became darker. I could have let them go. I could have packed up the operation and moved it to a different location, but there was too much money at stake, too many people depending on this shipment, too much risk that the Thompsons would bring law enforcement down on our entire network. Sullivan paused for a long moment.
So I made a decision that I've regretted every day since. I decided that the Thompson family had to be eliminated to protect our operation. Morrison realized she was listening to a confession of premeditated murder. I had my men surround the cottage and force the family down to the beach. David and Rebecca Thompson tried to protect their children, tried to negotiate for their release. But I knew that letting any of them live would be too dangerous. Sullivan's voice became flat, emotionless. We took them out to the largest boat, about 2 miles offshore where the water was deep and the currents were strong. I told them that if they promised to keep quiet about what they'd seen, we would let them go unharmed. Sullivan's voice became even colder. But I was lying. I had already decided that they all had to die. The children had seen our faces, heard our names. The parents would never stop trying to bring us to justice. There was no way to let them live and still protect our operation. Morrison felt nauseated. Sullivan was describing the calculated murder of 2 innocent children. I shot David Thompson first, 1 bullet to the head. He died instantly. Rebecca Thompson started screaming, begging me to spare the children. I shot her next. Sullivan paused, and Morrison could hear him taking a drink of something. The children, Emma and Michael, they were terrified beyond words. They were calling for their parents, trying to wake them up. It was... Sullivan's voice cracked slightly. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Morrison realized that even Sullivan had been affected by the horror of murdering children. I shot them both quickly. I didn't want them to suffer any more than necessary. They were innocent victims of their parents' bad timing. Sullivan's voice became more businesslike again. We weighted the bodies down with chains and anchor weights and dropped them in about 60 feet of water. The currents in that area are strong, and I knew the bodies would be carried far from shore and probably never recovered. Morrison made rapid notes about the location where the bodies had been disposed of. We cleaned up the cottage to make it look like the family had left voluntarily. We scattered some of their belongings on the beach to support the theory that they had been caught by a storm surge. We made sure there was no physical evidence that could link us to their disappearance. Sullivan paused again. The hardest part was dealing with the investigation. Sheriff Blake was more thorough than we had expected, and he was asking the right questions. He interviewed Carol Winters and me, and I could tell that he suspected something more than an accidental drowning. Morrison realized that Sullivan had been actively managing the cover-up while participating in the official investigation. That's when I contacted Sheriff Manning. Manning had been taking payments from our operation for over 2 years, helping us avoid law enforcement scrutiny in exchange for a percentage of our profits. Sullivan's voice became bitter. I told Manning that Blake's investigation was getting too close to the truth and that we needed it shut down immediately. Manning agreed to pressure Blake into closing the case quickly and accepting the storm surge theory. Morrison felt her blood boil. Chief Manning had been actively protecting murderers while preventing justice for the Thompson family. Manning was very effective. Within a week, Blake had been ordered to conclude his investigation and file a report blaming the family's disappearance on natural causes. The case was closed, and no further investigation was authorized. Sullivan took another labored breath. For the next several years, our operation continued to grow and prosper. We expanded our territory, increased our shipments, and corrupted more officials. The Thompson murders became just another cost of doing business. But success in the drug business is always temporary. By 2001, federal law enforcement agencies were closing in on our network. Several of our associates had been arrested, and it was clear that someone was cooperating with authorities. Sullivan's voice became more urgent.
Domingo decided that it was time to shut down the Cedar Island operation and move to a different base of operations. I was given a large payment and told to disappear, to never contact any of my former associates again. Morrison noted that Sullivan had been bought off and retired from criminal activity in 2001. I used the money to buy a small house in South Carolina, far from Cedar Island and far from anyone who knew about my past. I tried to live quietly, to forget about the things I had done, to convince myself that the Thompson murders were just a bad dream. Sullivan paused for a long moment, but you can't forget murdering children. You can't escape the memory of their faces, their voices, their terror. For 23 years, I've lived with nightmares, with guilt, with the knowledge that I destroyed an innocent family for money. Morrison could hear genuine remorse in Sullivan's voice, though she wondered if it was only because he was dying. I've also lived with the fear that someday someone would discover the truth about what happened that night. Carol Winters knew too much, Sheriff Blake had asked too many questions, and there were other people involved who might eventually talk. Sullivan's voice became more reflective. When I was diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago, I realized that I was going to die soon anyway. The fear of being caught and prosecuted didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was trying to find some way to make peace with what I had done. Morrison realized that Sullivan's confession was motivated more by his impending death than by genuine moral awakening. I want the Thompson family's bodies to be recovered and given a proper burial. I want their relatives to know what happened to them. I want the people who helped cover up their murders to be held accountable. Sullivan paused again. The bodies are located approximately 2 miles northeast of Cedar Island in about 60 feet of water near a rock formation called Devil's Triangle. The exact coordinates are 34 degrees, 47 minutes north, 76 degrees, 12 minutes west. Morrison made careful note of the coordinates. If Sullivan was telling the truth, the Thompson family's remains might finally be recovered. Chief Robert Manning took bribes from our operation from 1994 to 2001. He has bank records, offshore accounts, and property purchases that can't be explained by his police salary. He actively obstructed the Thompson investigation to protect our network. Carol Winters was an unwilling participant who was intimidated into silence. She watched the Thompson family being kidnapped and murdered, but she was too frightened to report what she had seen. She deserves forgiveness, not prosecution. Morrison noted that Sullivan was trying to protect Carol while implying Manning. Sheriff Blake conducted an honest investigation that was sabotaged by corrupt superiors. He suspected the truth about what happened to the Thompson family, but he was prevented from pursuing justice by people who were being paid to protect criminals. Sullivan took another drink. There were other people involved in our operation who are still alive and still living free. Domingo Restrepo returned to Colombia in 2001 and may still be operating drug trafficking networks. Several local officials took payments from us and helped cover up our activities. Morrison realized that Sullivan's confession could potentially expose a much larger criminal conspiracy. I know that confessing to these murders won't bring the Thompson family back. I know that nothing I say can undo the pain and loss that I caused. But I hope that finally telling the truth can help their family and friends find some measure of peace. Sullivan's voice became weaker. I also hope that the people who helped cover up these murders will finally be held accountable. Chief Manning in particular deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison for protecting killers and obstructing justice. Sullivan paused for his final statement. David Thompson was a good father who died trying to protect his family. Rebecca Thompson was a loving mother who died trying to save her children. Emma and Michael Thompson were innocent children who died because they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sullivan's voice became barely audible. I murdered them in cold blood for money. I destroyed their lives to protect my criminal enterprise. I am responsible for their deaths, and I accept full responsibility for the pain and suffering I caused.
If there is a God, I hope he can forgive me for what I've done. If there isn't, then I'll spend eternity knowing that I destroyed the most precious thing in the world, a loving family, for nothing more than money and power. The tape clicked off, leaving Morrison with a complete confession to quadruple murder and evidence of a conspiracy that had allowed the killers to escape justice for nearly 30 years. Morrison sat back in her chair. overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just heard. 3 witnesses had provided 3 different perspectives on the same horrific crime. Sheriff Blake had tried to seek justice, but had been thwarted by corruption. Carol Winters had witnessed the murders, but had been too terrified to speak. And Mike Sullivan had confessed to killing an entire family to protect his drug operation. Morrison reached for her phone to call the FBI. After 28 years, the Thompson family was finally going to get the justice they deserved. 18 months later, Detective Captain Sarah Morrison stood on the deck of a Coast Guard vessel as divers surfaced with the remains of the Thompson family. Using Mike Sullivan's coordinates, searchers had located the bodies exactly where the dying man had said they would be. The recovery operation had taken weeks, but forensic specialists had been able to identify all 4 family members through dental records and DNA analysis. David and Rebecca Thompson were finally going home, along with their children, Emma and Michael. Mike Sullivan had died 2 weeks after recording his confession, never living to see the consequences of his crimes. But his detailed testimony had provided prosecutors with everything they needed to pursue justice for the Thompson family.
The investigation that followed Sullivan's confession was unlike anything Detective Captain Morrison had ever seen. Within hours of discovering the audio recordings, the case had been transferred to a joint FBI Coast Guard task force specializing in cold case murders and organized crime. Special Agent Rebecca Chen, a 20-year veteran of the FBI's Violent Crime Division, was assigned as the lead investigator. Chen had built her career on cases exactly like this one, crimes that had been covered up by corrupt officials and allowed to fester for decades. The Sullivan confession gives us a roadmap, Chen explained to Morrison during their first meeting, but we need to verify every detail, follow every lead, and build a case that'll stand up in federal court after 28 years. The first priority was locating the Thompson family's remains. Sullivan had provided specific coordinates, but the ocean floor had changed significantly since 1996. Storms, currents, and natural sedimentation meant that the bodies might have moved from their original location. The Coast Guard deployed its most advanced deep-water recovery equipment to the area Sullivan had described. Side-scan sonar revealed several anomalies on the seafloor, including what appeared to be metal objects consistent with the anchor chain Sullivan had described using to weight down the bodies. Dr. Maria Santos, a forensic oceanographer from the University of North Carolina, was brought in to analyze the underwater conditions and predict where the remains might have settled over nearly 3 decades. Bodies weighted down in 60 feet of water don't stay in one place. Currents, storms, and marine life all affect the final resting place. We're looking at a search area of approximately 2 square miles. The diving operation began in early spring 2024, 6 months after Sullivan's confession had been discovered. The water was cold and visibility was limited, making the search both dangerous and technically challenging. Coast Guard divers worked in rotating teams, spending hours on the bottom using metal detectors and underwater cameras to search for any trace of the Thompson family. After 2 weeks of searching, they found the first piece of evidence, an anchor chain wrapped around what appeared to be human bones. Morrison watched from the support vessel as the divers carefully excavated the remains. Even after 28 years underwater, Dr. Santos was confident that enough DNA material would remain for positive identification. Salt water is actually quite good at preserving biological material. The cold temperatures and lack of oxygen at depth slow down decomposition significantly. As the recovery operation continued, more evidence emerged. The divers found additional bones, fragments of clothing, and pieces of jewelry that appeared to match descriptions of what the Thompson family had been wearing the night they disappeared. Most importantly, they found David Thompson's wallet, still containing his driver's license and credit cards. The plastic had protected the documents from complete degradation, providing crucial identification that would help prosecutors prove Sullivan's confession was accurate. The forensic analysis took another 3 months. DNA extracted from bone samples were compared against genetic material provided by surviving Thompson family members. The results confirmed what Sullivan had confessed. All 4 members of the Thompson family had been murdered and dumped in the ocean. While the recovery operation was proceeding, FBI agents were building cases against the living conspirators Sullivan had identified. Chief Robert Manning had retired to a luxury condominium in Naples, Florida, where he was living comfortably on what appeared to be a police pension supplemented by significant investment income.
Financial investigators quickly determined that Manning's lifestyle was inconsistent with his documented police salary. Bank records revealed a pattern of large cash deposits throughout the 1990s, totaling over $2 million that Manning could not explain. The FBI also discovered that Manning had purchased several properties in Florida and North Carolina using shell companies and offshore accounts, classic money laundering techniques used to hide criminal proceeds. Agent Chen personally led the team that arrested Manning at his Florida home. The 73-year-old former police chief was taken into custody without incident, though he maintained his innocence and demanded to speak with an attorney. Manning thought he was untouchable because of his law enforcement background. He never imagined that Sullivan would eventually confess, or that modern forensic techniques would be able to trace financial crimes committed decades earlier. While Manning was being processed in Florida, FBI agents were also locating and interviewing other individuals connected to Sullivan's drug operation. Most of the key players were either dead or had fled the country, but several minor participants were still living in the Cedar Island area. Carol Winters had been located within days of the confession being discovered. Now 62 years old, she was working as a house cleaner in a small coastal town about 50 miles from Cedar Island. The years of guilt and alcoholism had taken their toll, but she was lucid enough to provide detailed testimony about what she had witnessed.
"I've been waiting 28 years for someone to ask me the right questions," Carol told Agent Chen during her first formal interview. "I've practiced this story in my head so many times that I can tell you exactly what happened, minute by minute." Carol's testimony proved to be crucial in corroborating Sullivan's confession. Her description of the night's events matched Sullivan's account in nearly every detail, providing independent verification of how the murders had been committed. More importantly, Carol was able to provide additional information that Sullivan hadn't included in his confession. She identified several other people who had been involved in the drug operation, including local business owners who had provided logistical support and county officials who had been paid to look the other way. The case against Manning was strengthened by testimony from retired Sheriff David Blake, who had kept detailed personal notes about his investigation despite being ordered to close the case. Blake's notes documented Manning's suspicious behavior and his efforts to prevent a thorough investigation. "I knew something was wrong back in 1996, Blake testified before the federal grand jury. Manning was too eager to accept the storm surge theory, too resistant to following obvious leads. I should have fought harder to continue the investigation." Blake's testimony helped establish that Manning had not simply been incompetent or lazy, he had actively obstructed a murder investigation to protect criminals he was being paid to shield. The federal grand jury returned indictments against Manning on 17 different charges, including racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, he faced the possibility of life in prison. The case attracted national media attention when the indictments were unsealed. The story of a police chief who had protected drug dealers and covered up the murder of an innocent family resonated with a public increasingly concerned about police corruption and accountability. Manning's trial was scheduled to begin in federal court 18 months after Sullivan's confession had been discovered. Prosecutors felt confident that they had sufficient evidence to secure convictions on most of the charges, despite the passage of time and the death of their primary witness.
Chief Robert Manning, now 73 years old, had been arrested at his retirement home in Florida. Federal investigators had traced over $2 million in unexplained income to offshore accounts controlled by Manning. He was facing charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Carol Winters had testified before a federal grand jury, providing crucial corroboration for Sullivan's confession. Her detailed account of witnessing the Thompson family's kidnapping and murder had been instrumental in building the prosecution's case. In exchange for her cooperation, she had received immunity from prosecution. Sheriff David Blake, now retired, had been vindicated by the investigation. His original suspicions about the Thompson case had been proven correct, and his efforts to seek justice had been acknowledged by federal authorities. The systematic obstruction he had faced had been exposed as part of a broader pattern of corruption. The investigation had also revealed the full scope of the drug trafficking operation that had used Cedar Island as a base for nearly a decade. Records seized from Sullivan's associates had led to additional arrests and prosecutions, dismantling a network that had smuggled hundreds of millions of dollars worth of drugs into the United States. Morrison watched as the Thompson family's remains were transferred to a hearse for transport to the mainland. After 28 years,
David and Rebecca Thompson would finally be buried together, along with their children, their extended family, who had never stopped believing that they deserved justice, would finally have closure. The case had also led to broader reforms in how missing persons investigations were conducted. New protocols required multiple levels of oversight for cases involving suspected foul play, making it much more difficult for corrupt officials to obstruct justice. But for Morrison, the most important outcome was personal. The Thompson family's story had been told, their killers had been exposed, and their memory had been honored. They were no longer just 4 names in a cold case file. They were real people whose lives mattered, whose deaths had meaning, and whose legacy would help prevent similar tragedies in the future. As the Coast Guard vessel returned to shore, Morrison thought about the lesson of the Thompson case. Truth had a way of surfacing, even when powerful people tried to bury it. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied forever. And sometimes, the most important witness was the one who finally found the courage to speak, even when that courage came at the very end of life. The Thompson family was finally at peace. Their killers had been exposed, and their story would never be forgotten again. So there you have it. 3 witnesses, 3 different perspectives, and the shocking truth about Mike Sullivan's drug operation. But here's what I want to know. Did you suspect Sullivan from the beginning? When Sheriff Blake described being pressured to close the case, did you immediately think of corruption? Or were you surprised when Carol revealed the full extent of what she had witnessed? Let me know in the comments. At what point did you realize that this wasn't just a missing family case, but a calculated murder to protect a criminal empire? Was it when Blake mentioned the inconsistencies in the storm theory? When Carol described seeing the family forced onto boats? Or when Sullivan coldly confessed to executing children? This case shows us how corruption can allow killers to operate with impunity for decades. Sullivan didn't just murder the Thompson family, he had an entire network protecting him, from local police chiefs to Turtle Patrol volunteers who were too scared to speak up. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be told. We expose how authority figures can become the very criminals they're supposed to catch, and we honor victims whose voices were silenced by fear and corruption. Next week, a mother and daughter vanish from a hiking trail in 2003. 3 witnesses saw what happened, but 20 years later, when their car is found at the bottom of a quarry, investigators discover that one witness wasn't just lying about what they saw, they were covering up their own crime. Hit that subscribe button because sometimes the most important truth is the one people will kill to keep buried.